So in the next sort of 10-ish minutes or so, I want to shift gears to one final topic, and that is iron sulfate and dollar spot control. And the picture here on the screen is actually from the Toronto area. A superintendent that uses iron sulfate on his fairways on a regular basis and has found quite a bit of dollar spot suppression, and had an accidental skip, an accidental check plot, which I love check plots because they show you what works and what's not really doing anything. And here you can clearly see the amount of dollar spot pressure that was present at the site, and you can see the level of control that they're getting outside of this accidental check plot. So we looked at various aspects of iron sulfate. So Dave McCall and colleagues at Virginia Tech have looked at iron sulfate down in Virginia for dollar spot control for a number of years. We wanted to look at a couple of additional factors related to iron sulfate and water volume, and combining iron sulfate and urea together. So this is a study looking at the combination of iron sulfate and low rates of urea. And what we found is that, here's the urea on its own at a 7 or 14-day interval. And then here's the iron sulfate on its own down here. And so the iron sulfate was very effective on its own. And this September 4th, this is at our research station in Madison. It was the highest pressure point of the entire season. So that's why I chose this date. The urea didn't really add anything in addition to the iron sulfate. So if we were going to make recommendations based on this, you don't need to combine your urea with your iron sulfate. The iron sulfate alone is doing the heavy lifting, and the urea didn't really add anything. Now, if we take this research and combine it with the last research, maybe we're just at too low of a urea rate. Maybe we need to increase that rate. But what we can see from here is that combining sort of a low level of urea with the iron sulfate didn't add any additional control on to just the iron sulfate on its own. So this graph is kind of busy. So let me walk you through it. We looked at rate of iron sulfate, the water volume, and the reapplication interval in this particular study. So we have three rates. We have 91, 183, and 366 grams of iron sulfate per 100 square meters. That correlates to 3, 6, and 12 ounces per 1,000 square feet. We also had a water volume of 3/4 of a gallon, 1.5 gallons, and 3 gallons. And then we had two reapplication intervals, 7 versus 14 days. What we can clearly say from this work is that the 7-day reapplication interval is better than the 14-day reapplication interval. So if you have the means to apply at a 7-day interval, you're going to get much better dollar spot control at that reapplication interval than 14 days. There's also a clear iron sulfate rate impact. The higher the rate of iron sulfate, the more dollar spot control that you get. However, 3 ounces, you get definitely some. Here's 3 ounces compared to nothing. You get a lot of reduction, but much less than at 6 ounces. At 12 ounces, you get very little dollar spot, but it's also phytotoxic. That turf is black as hell, and you're getting some phytotoxicity to your annual bluegrass. So what we found is that 3 ounces is kind of a good starting point to get you comfortable with it. And then after you're comfortable with that, after maybe a year or two, you go up to 6 ounces of iron sulfate. And that's kind of what we found has been a good middle ground of good dollar spot reduction and not much in the way of phytotoxicity. We didn't really find much in the way of an impact of water volume. There was a couple of data points where the higher the water volume, the more effective the iron sulfate was. So at this, the left side of this graph, we're showing that the 3-gallon water volume was more effective than the 3/4 gallon. But that wasn't always the case. At the 14-day interval, we didn't see any impact of the water volume, and at many other rating dates, even at the 7-day interval, we didn't see an impact of water volume either. So if anything, it appears that the higher water volumes lead to better dollar spot reductions, but that data was pretty unclear and not really convincing in any direction. All right, so here's a picture. This was from mid-July, some pretty high pressure from 2019, I believe. And so obviously the non-treated is riddled, and there is the iron sulfate on the right, providing excellent dollar spot reductions. What I will say about iron sulfate, I've talked very positively over here about it for the last several minutes. But one thing I will say about iron sulfate is that we have noticed it to be a little bit inconsistent. So sometimes it provides excellent control and you never think you need a fungicide again. And then a couple weeks later, it doesn't provide very good control and you have a lot of dollar spot. So a couple things that I think are happening there. One, iron sulfate only works to a certain level of dollar spot pressure. Once you get so much pressure, eventually the fungus overcomes the iron sulfate and it still causes disease. We've seen that consistently year in, year out. The other thing I think is that what iron sulfate is doing is it's acting like a weak fungicide against the dollar spot fungus. It's not, it's not stimulating any defense response in the plant that we can tell. It's really just acting like a weak, short-lived fungicide against the fungus. And so if you time that iron sulfate application just right, when the dollar spot fungus is growing, it will absorb the iron sulfate, it will knock it back, and you'll get good control. However, if you apply that iron sulfate, and for whatever reason, maybe it's too cool or too dry or whatever, if you apply that iron sulfate when the fungus is not actively growing, then the fungus won't take it up, and the iron sulfate breaks down within a day or two. And then if that's when the fungus starts growing after that, then you really had almost no impact on the fungus. Whereas most traditional synthetic fungicides last in the environment, in the turf environment, for probably 7 to 10 days. Iron sulfate probably works for 1 to 2 days. And that's one thing that's led to some inconsistencies in our research. We've also noticed some phytotoxicity, especially on annual bluegrass, when it gets hot and dry. It tends to really be in the hot and dry periods. Not even really, it's almost more of a drought issue than a temperature issue, because we've seen it, relatively cool or mild, I would say, maybe 26, 28 degrees Celsius. And if it's dry, we still see some damage on the annual bluegrass. We haven't seen any lasting damage on creeping bentgrass. In our climate in Madison, it's only been on annual bluegrass. But I think if you go further south into some much hotter climates, I do think they have seen some damage on creeping bentgrass as well. So, the inconsistency and the potential damage on the annual bluegrass. We have not really seen any of that at the 3-ounce rate, very little of it at the 6-ounce rate, much more of it at the 12-ounce rate. All right, so just kind of summarize this last point here. We've noticed clear dollar spot reductions, but the control remains inconsistent for what from what I've just explained to you why. The shorter intervals are better, and why those shorter intervals are better is simple, right? If it's a short-lived, weak fungicide, the more often you apply it, the better the chances are that you're going to apply it when the fungus is growing, right? There are certainly still concerns over phytotoxicity under those hot, dry conditions and on annual bluegrass. We haven't noticed it often, but typically there's a period almost every year where we start to see the annual bluegrass stress out a bit in those plots. But one big advantage is cost, and that's really why a lot of facilities have looked at using iron sulfate. And so the iron sulfate heptahydrate product that we have used in our research is Extreme Green 20 from Simplot. And at the 6-ounce rate, that comes to about $6 US per acre on average. So that's quite a bit cheaper than even some of the cheaper fungicides. So my personal opinion on this is that you're not going to eliminate your fungicides by implementing an iron sulfate program, but you can have some relatively significant reductions depending on how you do it. Also, depending on your ability to get out there and spray often and have good agitation in your tank. One thing that we've noticed, a lot of lower budget facilities are really interested in doing this, but they oftentimes don't have the spray capacity to do it. Either their sprayer is really old and it just doesn't work very well, or they don't have good agitation, or they don't have the staff to get out there on a regular basis. If you can only get out there every 21, 28 days to do it on fairways, the benefit you're going to see, there's going to be some benefit, but it's going to be much more limited than if you could do it on a more regular basis. So, certainly not going to replace fungicides by any means anytime soon, but there are some advantages, and they certainly can be implemented into a fungicide program. I would mostly focus on your fairways for this and not on your putting greens, especially if they're sand-based greens. Just because there has been some concern about that iron oxide layer that can develop at the base of a USGA green. So I would focus this on your fairways for this point in time.